So, structural theories of racial and ethnic inequality, which will be our topic for this video, are the last of the three sets of explanations for racial and ethnic inequality. Uh, I will say that structural theories have the highest level of empirical support, right? So, I think in the first video I mentioned that what makes a theory a good theory is that it generates testable predictions and that those testable predictions are supported by data. Structural theories have the greatest amount of empirical support, but they are the least popular of the three sets of theories because they're incredibly complex and because of the nature of the themes, the key themes that underlie these theories. And I'll get into those in just a moment. But I just want to say that when we talk about structural discrimination theories, what we're talking about are explanations that look at institutionalized patterns of discrimination. And that see those as the source of the secondary status of subordinate groups. So to say that something is institutionalized means that it's been built into the structures and organizations that make up a society. Remember, an institution is a broad set of practices and structures built around some essential or critical element of society. So to say that something has become institutionalized means it's been kind of incorporated into that. It isn't kind of floating out in like an isolated part of society, but rather kind of built into the everyday fundamental nature of that society. So again, very, very strong empirical support, incredibly low popularity, in part, I think, because it's sort of intimidating, right? I mean, how do you change an institution, right? It's a really, really large structure, and it requires a significant amount of effort. And we as a culture, we as a society are not particularly inclined to make radical transformations of the society around us, even if we could somehow get everybody to agree that a thing is happening. It's very hard sometimes to get people to see something that's happening at the institutional level, right? At the structural level. Things that a person does or fails to do, those are easy to point out, right? We can see a person, we can understand that. But most people in the United States and other societies lack the sociological imagination to take that step back and see structural or systemic patterns and practices that create inequality or sustain inequality or make it very difficult for people to escape inequality. So there are some basic themes that you find that are woven into structural or institutional discrimination theories. The first is that history is critical in creating both present conditions, but also resistance to change. Right, so this is one of the things that Omi and Winat talk about in describing that process of racial formation. Right, that as these categories are formed up and as there are beneficiaries on one side of the color line, for example, it becomes really hard to convince those people to give up those advantages, especially to the degree to which those advantages become essentialized, right? That the people who benefit from them see them as reflections of their efforts and their contributions rather than a set of social arrangements that have been in place for, in some cases, centuries. So, institutions in the United States have historically defined and enforced racially distinct norms, for example, like the patterns of behavior that are expected of particular communities of the various racial and ethnic categories out there. Result in people behaving, in a way that reflects those racially distinct norms. And it becomes very, very easy to see the way in which, or to see those norms as a reflection of an innate tendency among those people, as opposed to, behavioral expectations that were placed on them, or limits to particular options for behaviors that were placed in front of them. So what happens is a pattern of inequality gets established initially, and then gets normalized and legitimized over time to the point where its connections to that, sort of original process, or that original social need that it was created um, to serve, gets lost, right? This is why, conversations about where racial categories in the United States come from are often met with, sort of, a shrug, an assumption that, it's always been this way, because, we don't see the historical roots of it. I mean, they're there, right? We talked about Bacon's Rebellion. We talked about the reactions to Bacon's Rebellion in the form of slave codes and black codes that begin to emerge in the early 1700s as a way of kind of institutionalizing and formalizing lifetime servitude for blacks, and the reasons why, or the processes through which, and the benefits and consequences of those structures were kind of spelled out, right? Slavery becomes really easy to sustain and police if it is congruent with racial categories. But you have to create the racial categories, right, to be able to do that. You have to have some criteria into which, or through which you're going to sort people into categories. And then, of course, once you've sorted people into those categories, you have to think about them differently. You have to build ideologies that make what you're doing seem appropriate and proper. And if that gets started in the late 1600s and early 1700s, then a person born in 1993 who doesn't really particularly study history, and let's face it, even if they did study history, if they did it in an American public school, are probably not very likely to get all of that sort of minutia, all of that little nitty gritty, right? They're going to learn the big broad lessons. And a lot of those are kind of a reflection of state propaganda or a particular social narrative about the kind of country America is, in which we downplay the uglier elements of our past in favor of the more celebratory aspects of it. Right, so how would somebody arriving that late to the game have a foundation for sort of understanding that present attitudes about racial groups in the United States have their origins and roots in the early 1700s? Right, that seems antithetical. Instead, the grievous omissions of the founding of this country, right, not including women as equal citizens, not including blacks as equal citizens, certainly not including the indigenous population as equal citizens. All of those things are treated as a kind of oversight, and one that the founders kind of built a set of correctives into the Constitution to address, because, they wanted that to happen at some point. There's no evidence that suggests that that was ever their intention, even if it is in fact something that subsequent generations have kind of utilized to sort of try to improve the society. There was ample opportunity for people at the founding to address some of these questions, and they chose not to, in part because they were the beneficiaries of a system in which, slaveholding states would still be very much part of the country, even as individual citizens in some of these places found the practice of slavery to be personally aberrant, right, and disgusting or abhorrent. It was nevertheless built into the founding documents of the country. So, again, unless you go back to the beginning, unless you have a sense of history and how history has operated to create where we are now, it's going to be really, really hard to understand the nature of where we are now, right? So you got to pay attention to those conditions that came before the present moment. So that's the first theme in any kind of set of theories about institutional or structural discrimination. The second theme is to recognize and to account for the fact that discrimination can occur without conscious bigotry, without racist intent. This is a really hard thing for some people to understand, and for some people who can understand it, there's often a willful decision to sort of not understand it or to pretend like they don't understand it. But here's the thing: we can get discriminatory outcomes even in the complete absence of overt racist individuals, overtly racist individuals. We'll talk at the end of the semester about Bonilla Silva's concept of colorblind racism, but here's an early kind of introduction to that. There are a lot of examples of this. It's not that hard to see once you know what you're looking for. But like, for example, how we fund K through 12 education in the United States, right? We do that through property taxes. The more affluent your community is, the higher the tax base, the greater the tax base. The greater the tax base, the more generously you can fund your public schools, your local schools. Poorer communities where property values are lower will have fewer financial resources to fund their public schools. Now, just putting aside for a second, and I'm really not quite sure why we would want to do this, but just for the sake of argument, let's put aside for a second whether it's okay or not to say, rich communities deserve better schools than poor communities. That's kind of messed up, if you ask me. But putting that aside for a moment, if we know that people of color are more likely to be poor than white people are likely to be poor, and we fund our public school system through property taxes, which are a function of the affluence or poverty of a community, then we know that students of color are more likely to go to underfunded public schools than white students. Right? There's your racial discrimination, even though the law itself and the people who are putting those policies into practice might not be racist at all, right? But the policies or the institutional practices are. And if people can't wrap their head around the idea that you can get discrimination even if people don't quote unquote intend to discriminate when they enact a policy or when they enforce a policy, then it's going to be really, really hard to get them to understand how structural processes can result in racial and ethnic inequality. The third theme in these theories is that institutional discrimination is less visible. Right? Individual acts of discrimination are more overt. You can see them, you can react to them. This is why, bias theories are so popular, right? Because you can point to the bad actors who are engaging in discriminatory behaviors. Institutional discrimination requires, an ability to take a step back and to see a big picture, to recognize how structure operates, and that structure can operate differently than the operation of individual people within those structures, right? If people can't see that, then it's going to be hard for them to see institutional discrimination. They're much more likely to just see it as the sort of the normal operation of the way society is, and some people benefit and other people kind of fall by the wayside. So that's the third theme. The fourth theme, and this will be where we kind of wrap this up, the fourth theme of these theories of institutional or structural discrimination is that institutional discrimination is reinforced by the interconnected nature of institutions, right? One of the things that you begin to appreciate as you sort of develop a sociological lens through which you can look at the world is the way in which everything is sort of interconnected. At the structural level. So, education, like colleges and universities, for example, education is, as an institution, a set of arrangements through which we transfer skills and knowledge from one generation to another. An economy is a system in which we produce and distribute socially necessary resources, right? So those are two sort of different things, but the education system is deeply interconnected with the economic institutions, the structures and the organizations within the economic institution of the economy. So excluding minorities from educational opportunities or relegating a greater percentage of minorities to underfunded public schools is going to leave them less well positioned to be competitive in the labor force, right? And so what's happening over here in the area of educational systems is going to have an impact on what's happening over here in the area of opportunities within the economy, right? So because institutions are interconnected, what's happening in one place is going to have an effect, a discriminatory impact or a discriminatory effect in another part of society. And if people don't see the way in which institutions are interconnected with and reinforce other institutions, that's going to get lost, right? So all of this stuff sort of works to make these structural theories harder to explain, harder to embrace, harder to sort of engage, which is a shame because this is where the entrenched inequality in our society really is. We've done a remarkable job in the United States since the 1940s, 1950s in reducing individual level prejudice and bigotry. It's not gone, not by a long shot, and there's far too much of it for us, I think, to tolerate. But we're better. We I think it's empirically, I mean, it's safe to say as anything that American society in 2022 is less overtly racist than American society in 1922. In 1922, we were a year out from a race massacre in which probably as many as 300 Black Tulsans were killed by other citizens of the city of Tulsa, white citizens of the city of Tulsa. All because, Black people stood up and dared to try to prevent a lynching. So are things better 100 years out from Tulsa? Absolutely. But that is not to say that we don't have a long way to go. The problem is the battle lines, the place where we're having our fight now isn't in getting people to embrace pluralism or multiculturalism. I think that is largely accomplished, and we need to keep pushing on that front because there are still people who resist. But I think we've been tremendously successful there. Where we've been less successful is unraveling policies and practices, changing laws, looking at systemic practices and structural features of society where these the consequence of just the everyday regular operation of these processes results in racial and ethnic inequality. And that's the frontier where we should be having the next set of movements and battles to try to make this a more equitable and a more just society. So that's why these theories are really important, and it's important to get people to sort of see them because there's nothing about them that is just intuitive or easy, right? It takes a lot of work to get people to see these things, and that's kind of on us to make sure that they get to that point. All right. So that wraps up the last of these theories of racial and ethnic inequality. Next time we'll talk a little bit about trends in assimilation and pluralism, especially post-1965, which is a very interesting period. So until then, have a good one.